The fluorescent lights of Liberty International Airport cast a harsh, impersonal glow over the bustling crowd. The sounds of rolling luggage, flight announcements, and chatting families blended into a constant hum. James Foster, dressed in a dark gray suit with neatly trimmed hair showing a touch of gray, stood at baggage carousel number 5, checking his phone. It had been a long flight from the West Coast, and all he wanted now was his suitcase and a quiet evening at home. But Foster was no ordinary passenger. He was James Foster, the director of the Internal Affairs Division, tasked with overseeing police misconduct in the city. As head of IAD, he had made many enemies in law enforcement, but that came with the job. Still, tonight, he didn't expect to be caught up in anything more than the usual travel stress. Meanwhile, Jack Peterson and his younger partner, Kevin Doyle, were on routine patrol near the baggage claim area. Peterson, a middle-aged officer with a permanent scowl, had worked at the airport for over 2 decades. His experience had hardened him, and over the years, his biases had grown stronger. He had a quick temper and a tendency to profile anyone who didn't look like him. "Another boring night," Peterson muttered to Doyle, scanning the crowd. "Same old stuff. Nothing exciting." Doyle, younger and still adjusting to the job, only nodded. He wasn't used to Peterson's cynicism, but had learned not to challenge him. That was when the radio crackled to life. A dispatch report came through, alerting all units in the area about a suspicious person. Report of a black male in a dark suit acting suspiciously near Carousel 5, the voice on the radio said. Peterson's eyes lit up. "A black guy in a dark suit? Perfect. Let's check this out." Doyle hesitated. The description was vague, and the word suspicious didn't sit right with him. "Suspicious how?" he muttered, more to himself. "Doesn't matter," Peterson snapped, his voice eager. "Let's go." Foster, still unaware of the growing attention, was waiting patiently for his luggage. The last thing he expected was to be the target of a police officer's suspicion based on nothing but the color of his skin. Peterson and Doyle approached him quickly. Foster didn't notice them until Peterson stood directly in front of him, blocking his view of the baggage carousel. "Excuse me, sir," Peterson said curtly. "We need to talk to you." Foster looked up, slightly startled. "What's going on, officer?" he asked politely, noticing Peterson's badge. Peterson didn't answer. "What are you doing here?" "I'm just waiting for my luggage," Foster replied, his voice steady. "I just got off the plane from Los Angeles." "Let me see your ID," Peterson demanded, his tone sharpening. Foster, confused but calm, pulled out his wallet and handed over his driver's license. Peterson studied it for a moment before handing it back, his eyes never leaving Foster's face. "Where are you from?" Peterson asked, his voice now condescending. "What's your business in town?" "I just told you," Foster said, his patience beginning to wear thin. "I'm here for a conference, and I'm heading home now." Peterson's expression hardened. "You look suspicious," he muttered. "Maybe you're waiting for someone, or transporting something. You know, people like you always have something to hide." Foster felt his anger rise. He was being judged based on assumptions, not facts. "Officer, I don't know what you think you're doing, but I demand to speak to your superior." Peterson sneered, his ego bruised by the challenge. "Oh, you want to talk to my boss? You're obstructing an officer." Turning to Doyle, Peterson snapped, "Handcuff him. We're taking him in." Foster's stomach churned as Doyle hesitated, but under Peterson's sharp gaze, Doyle reluctantly pulled out the handcuffs. The cold metal clicked shut around Foster's wrists, and the humiliation hit him like a physical blow. As Peterson recited the Miranda rights in a triumphantly mechanical tone, Foster closed his eyes for a brief moment. He couldn't believe this was happening. To him, a man who fought corruption in the police force. Foster's mind raced as the officers began to escort him away. His wrist burned from the cold metal cuffs, but the humiliation he felt was worse. He was the head of Internal Affairs, the very division responsible for holding corrupt cops accountable. And yet here he was, treated like a criminal. He struggled to keep his composure, his eyes scanning the crowd. People were staring, some whispering to each other, others clearly uncomfortable but too afraid to intervene. "Keep moving," Peterson growled, leading him toward the exit. Foster kept his head high, refusing to let them break his spirit, though inside the rage was building. As they passed a group of passengers near the terminal entrance, Foster could see the shock on their faces. They knew something wasn't right. His heart ached. How could this be happening? Was this what everyone else felt when they were unjustly detained, falsely accused, and mistreated? Foster's thoughts were interrupted when Peterson suddenly stopped and turned to face him. "You don't get to make demands, you understand? This is how it works. We're the ones in charge here, not you." Foster's voice grew harder, despite the mounting pressure. "You're wrong, officer. I have every right to be treated with respect, and you're crossing a line." He was trying to maintain his calm, but the more Peterson pushed, the more his patience wore thin. That's when Doyle, still trailing behind, looked uneasy. He hadn't said much during the confrontation, but now he could see just how wrong this was. His partner was losing control, and the man in front of him was not some random passenger, but the head of the very department that oversaw police conduct. His discomfort grew with each step. As they reached the exit, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "Peterson, Doyle, what's going on here?" All three men froze. Chief Michael Donovan, standing a few feet away, was looking directly at them. He wasn't in uniform. The plain clothes and his surprised expression made it clear that he wasn't expecting to see this. Foster's eyes met Donovan's, and for a brief moment, relief flooded through him. Donovan was someone he knew well, an old acquaintance, and someone who had a deep respect for the Internal Affairs Division. But now Foster needed him more than ever. Donovan's gaze quickly shifted from Peterson and Doyle to Foster's handcuffed wrists. His shock turned to anger in an instant. "What the hell is going on here, Peterson?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the noise of the terminal. "Why is the Director of Internal Affairs in handcuffs?" Peterson's face drained of color. He stammered, fumbling for an explanation. "Chief, there was a report about a suspicious individual. We were just doing our job." "A suspicious individual?" Donovan's voice rose, disbelief in every word. "You're telling me you arrested James Foster, the Director of Internal Affairs, based on a vague report and nothing more?" Peterson's eyes darted around nervously. "But sir, the report said he matched the description of a suspect." Donovan's stare hardened. "And what was suspicious about him, exactly?" "He's standing here waiting for his luggage." He turned sharply toward Doyle, who was still holding the handcuffs. "Doyle, you're better than this. Don't let Peterson drag you into this mess." Doyle, his face pale with shame, quickly stepped forward and began unlocking the cuffs. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know." Donovan ignored him, his attention focused solely on Peterson. "Peterson, do you realize what you've done? You've just arrested the head of my department, the very person responsible for overseeing police misconduct, and you don't even have a reasonable explanation." Peterson, now realizing the magnitude of his mistake, began to sputter. It's just a misunderstanding, Chief. We got the report and you didn't think to check?" Donovan cut him off sharply. "This man, Foster, is the one who ensures we follow the rules, and you treat him like a criminal?" Foster's jaw tightened. He had hoped that his identity alone would clear things up. But now, even though Donovan had stepped in, he could feel the weight of the situation settle heavily on his shoulders. Donovan turned back to Foster, his expression softening. "James, I am so sorry about this," he said, his voice full of genuine concern. "We'll get this sorted out, I promise you. But for now, let's get you out of here." Foster nodded, but the sting of the situation still lingered. As he stood there, handcuffs now removed, he couldn't help but wonder. What if Donovan hadn't been there? What if no one had known who he was? Donovan's presence seemed to snap Peterson out of his stupor. The officer's face was ashen, his earlier cockiness replaced by a nervous tension that wasn't lost on Foster. Peterson stammered as he fumbled with his radio, trying to find words to explain his actions, but his voice cracked in the face of Donovan's fury. I didn't mean for this to happen, Chief," Peterson muttered, barely able to make eye contact. "We got a call about a suspicious person matching his description. I thought we were just doing our job." Donovan's glare could have frozen water. He crossed his arms over his chest and leaned forward, his voice cutting through the dim hum of the airport. "A vague tip about a suspicious person? Is that your excuse? You're telling me you didn't recognize James Foster, the Director of Internal Affairs?" "Do you know who he is, Peterson?" Peterson's throat tightened as he realized what he had done. His face flushed with shame. "I didn't realize, Chief. I didn't think—" "I'll tell you what you didn't think," Donovan interrupted, his voice colder than before. "You didn't think about the consequences of your actions. You didn't think about what would happen if you made a mistake. And now you've got the head of my oversight division in handcuffs for what? Because you couldn't bother to look past a tip from an anonymous caller?" Foster, who had been silently observing the exchange, couldn't help but feel a flicker of gratitude toward Donovan. It wasn't just the apology, it was the understanding in Donovan's voice. The chief was one of the few people in the department who truly valued the role of internal affairs, even when it put him at odds with his own officers. Donovan turned back to Doyle, who was standing quietly by, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Kevin," Donovan said, his tone softening slightly, "this is a mess. I know Peterson is your senior, but you need to start thinking for yourself. This isn't the way we do things in this department." Doyle nodded, his face a mixture of guilt and regret. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen, sir. I was just following orders." "Following orders?" Donovan's voice hardened again. "This isn't the military, Doyle. You have a responsibility to act with integrity, not blindly follow someone who's acting out of prejudice." Doyle's eyes were wide, and his hands shook slightly as he rubbed them together. I understand, Chief. I'll do better next time." Foster felt a pang of sympathy for Doyle. He wasn't excusing his actions, but he could see the young officer was genuinely remorseful. The look of fear in his eyes suggested that he knew how deep the hole was that he had just stepped into. Peterson, on the other hand, was still too proud to admit the full extent of his mistake. His posture remained rigid, and he kept his gaze on the ground, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. "I'll handle this from here," Donovan said, his gaze fixed on Foster. "James, I'm truly sorry about all this. You shouldn't have had to experience this. Let's get you out of here quietly, and I'll personally make sure Peterson and Doyle face the consequences of their actions." Foster nodded silently. He could feel his anger simmering beneath the surface, but he kept it under control. This wasn't the time or place to let his emotions run wild. There was a process, and he knew all too well how that process worked. The officers would be investigated, and they would face consequences. But it wasn't going to be easy, not for anyone. As they walked towards the exit, Foster's mind wandered to the bigger picture. He was grateful for Donovan's intervention, but what about all the others who didn't have someone like him to step in? How many people had been wrongly detained or mistreated by officers who acted based on assumptions or prejudice? The airport's fluorescent lights felt even colder now, their harsh glow reminding him that this fight wasn't over. This was just one incident, one that, thankfully, was resolved with the help of a few key individuals. But there were countless others, just as unjust and just as painful, that needed attention. And that was exactly why he couldn't stop now. As they exited the airport, Donovan motioned to one of his assistants to take Foster's luggage. "Let's get you home, James." This night's done. But for Foster, it wasn't done. He would carry the weight of this moment with him. It was just another reminder of the work that lay ahead. The next few days passed in a blur for James Foster. What should have been a simple incident had quickly spiraled into something far bigger than he had expected. His mind kept returning to that moment in the airport. The cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his skin, the whispers of curious onlookers, and the humiliation he felt standing in front of Chief Donovan. It was a stark reminder of the work he had done over the years, fighting corruption, bias, and misconduct within the police force. But now he was on the receiving end. The internal investigation was swift. Donovan, true to his word, had taken full control of the matter. He called in an external team of investigators to avoid any potential conflict of interest. Foster had recused himself from directly overseeing the case, but he still felt the sting of irony. He was the victim of police abuse, but he also had to ensure that the department remained transparent and accountable. The investigation quickly revealed the extent of the misconduct. Peterson, despite his years of service, had a troubling history of bias. Witness interviews, including statements from several passengers who had been near Foster when the incident occurred, confirmed that the arrest was not only unnecessary, but deeply prejudiced. Peterson had a reputation for targeting people of color, especially those he deemed out of place. The vague tip he had received was just an excuse to act on his own prejudices. Kevin Doyle, on the other hand, had been less proactive. The young officer admitted in his interview that he was uncomfortable with Peterson's approach, but he had been too afraid to speak up. His silence, however, only compounded the issue. While Doyle lacked the same animosity as Peterson, his failure to intervene had allowed the situation to escalate. Foster felt conflicted. On one hand, he understood the pressures that Doyle was under. The young officer had been trying to follow his senior's orders, not wanting to rock the boat. On the other hand, Doyle's lack of courage to step in when he knew something was wrong made him complicit in the injustice. Foster knew it was a harsh lesson, but one that needed to be learned. By the end of the week, the findings were in. Peterson's history of racial profiling, combined with his blatant abuse of authority during the arrest, made his actions unforgivable. Doyle, while less culpable, had failed to intervene and allow the abuse to continue unchecked. As a result, both men were put on administrative leave pending termination. Foster, though still shaken by the entire ordeal, knew that the next steps were crucial. Chief Donovan had promised a thorough review of Peterson's and Doyle's actions, and he made it clear that the department would not tolerate this kind of behavior. The public was watching, and so was the media. The pressure on the department to act decisively was immense. One morning, as Foster sat at his desk, the phone rang. It was Donovan, his voice calm but firm. "James, it's done. Peterson and Doyle have been fired. We've also launched an investigation into their conduct. We're treating this like it's a full-blown criminal case. The DA's office is involved, and they're taking this seriously." Foster felt a weight lift off his shoulders, but it was short-lived. While the internal investigation had reached a conclusion, the real challenge was just beginning. Peterson and Doyle would face criminal charges, and the trial would bring the department into the spotlight. Foster stared out of his office window. The city skyline spread before him. Despite the victory, the fight was far from over. He had spent years trying to expose and eradicate corruption within the force, and this was just one battle in a much larger war. The incident had highlighted the deeply ingrained racism that still existed in the department and in the world at large. It wasn't just about these two officers. It was about a culture that allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. As Foster reflected on everything that had transpired, he couldn't help but think of the countless other victims of police bias and abuse. They didn't have the power, the position, or the influence to make their voices heard. But Foster knew that this case would set a precedent. If justice could be served for him, it could be served for anyone who had suffered because of systemic inequality. "Justice isn't a quick fix," Foster muttered to himself, "but it's a start." The trial was a media circus. As soon as the charges were made against Peterson and Doyle, the press descended, eager to capitalize on the story of police misconduct involving the head of the Internal Affairs Division. The courthouse was packed with reporters, cameras flashing as Foster walked in to testify. His heart was heavy, but he knew this moment was important, not just for him, but for every person who had ever been unjustly detained, profiled, or mistreated. Foster took the stand, his voice calm but resolute as he recounted the events at the airport. He described the moment he was handcuffed, the feeling of helplessness, the shame, and the sting of being treated like a criminal simply because of the color of his skin. He wasn't speaking just for himself, he was speaking for the countless others who didn't have the platform to tell their story. "I don't stand here today for personal vengeance," Foster said, his eyes meeting the jury. "I stand here for principle. I stand here for all those who don't have a voice, those who suffer quietly every day because of the prejudice that still runs rampant in our institutions. This isn't just about me. This is about the system that allows people like Peterson to continue abusing their power without consequence." It was a powerful statement, one that resonated deeply with the jury, but the defense was relentless. They tried to paint Peterson as a well-meaning officer who had simply made a mistake under pressure. They claimed the arrest had been a misunderstanding, a knee-jerk reaction to a vague tip. As for Doyle, they argued that he was just a young officer caught in an uncomfortable situation, too afraid to speak up. But Foster wasn't having it. Under cross-examination, he kept his calm and pointed out the inconsistencies in Peterson's testimony. He highlighted the racial bias behind Peterson's actions and the failure of Doyle to intervene when he knew the arrest was unjust. He made it clear that this wasn't a simple case of poor judgment. This was an act of prejudice and abuse of power. Weeks later, the jury deliberated. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Finally, the foreman stood, and the verdict was read. Peterson was found guilty of unlawful detention and violating civil rights. Doyle was also found guilty of complicity in the unlawful arrest, though his sentence was slightly less severe. As the gavel struck, the courtroom erupted into a mixture of relief and sorrow. The relief came from knowing that justice had been served, but the sorrow came from the realization that it had taken a terrible event for the system to finally hold these officers accountable. The damage had already been done, and the scars left on the public's trust in law enforcement would take time to heal. Peterson was sentenced to 6 years in prison, while Doyle received a 4-year sentence. As the two former officers were led away in handcuffs, their faces pale and filled with regret, Foster watched in silence. There was no joy in the victory, no satisfaction in seeing them punished. It was a grim reminder of how deeply racism and abuse of power could permeate institutions meant to protect the public. In the weeks that followed, Chief Donovan initiated a series of department-wide training programs on bias, racism, and the proper use of force. The department began reviewing its protocols for handling suspicious persons, ensuring that such a mistake would never happen again. But Foster knew that these changes, while important, were only the beginning. The real work was changing the culture of law enforcement, a culture that allowed officers like Peterson to thrive. As Foster sat at his desk in the Internal Affairs office, he thought about the years he had spent in this role. He had come across so many cases of misconduct, but this one was different. This case had touched him in a way none of the others had. It had shown him that even the system he was trying to reform could turn on him, but it had also shown him that justice, when pursued relentlessly, could still prevail. There was no happy ending to this story. Peterson and Doyle had paid for their actions, but the damage they caused to trust in the police force would linger. Foster poured himself a glass of scotch, staring out at the city skyline. It was a bittersweet victory. The fight wasn't over, but it was a fight he would continue, day by day, case by case, for as long as it took. This story is a reminder that justice is not always served quickly or easily, but it can be served when individuals refuse to let it slide. It shows us that prejudice and abuse of power still exist in places where we least expect it, and that those who are in positions of power must be held accountable. But perhaps most importantly, it teaches us that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, and that each of us has a responsibility to speak up and stand against the wrongs we see, no matter how difficult it may be.